ban on Zimbabwean diamonds. The Kimberley Process is the international certification system for diamonds, and there's a view that diamonds out of the Marange-Fields have been extracted under human rights abuses. That's the one contention. Others believe that's an exaggerated view and that Zimbabwean diamonds are legal tender. Now, joining us now on the subject of Zimbabwe's diamonds is Abbey Chikane, who's the founding chairman of the Kimberley Process. He's also the Zimbabwe Monitor, and he's also the CEO of Sub-Saharan Investments. But today he's here in his capacity as the Zimbabwe Monitor. Thank you very much for coming through. Now, heated talks which deadlocked on some occasions concerning this issue of whether Zimbabwean diamonds are conflict diamonds. What's your view as the Monitor?
First of all, I need to contextualize the situation in Zimbabwe, and I wouldn't take you very far just to say that in November 2009 there was a plenary in Swakopmund whereby the Kimberley Process, together with the industry and NGO, resolved to establish what we call today a team, or rather a joint work plan by the Kimberley Process, which is aimed at bringing Zimbabwe to full compliance with the Kimberley Process. And I think it's also important to mention that within the context of the Kimberley Process document, there is what is referred to as minimum requirements. And those requirements, among other things, include the enactment of diamond-specific legislation, statistical account of their production, import, export. It also requires them to have a Kimberley certificate, which has to be forgery resistant and tamper-proof. They also have to have what we call a designated authority, which is responsible for monitoring the import and export of diamonds. And lastly, of course, they are required to participate in what we call regional cooperation and transparency, etc. Unfortunately, those minimum requirements had to be minimum because right at inception, we had countries such as North America, Europe, North America, Africa, Australasia, Middle East, etc. And we needed to agree on some requirements, and they had to be minimum because of political, ideological, and all sorts of other reasons, and hence those minimum requirements were accepted at that particular time.
Going back to the situation in Zimbabwe, you drafted a report, and it's reported in the media that you suggested there should be a reprieve on Zimbabwe and that diamond exports should be allowed from Zimbabwe, and yet there is a sense that you're not considering the fact that the Marange-Fields were seized brutally by the Zimbabwean military. Over 200 people were killed, and that although it's a low-intensity conflict, it's nonetheless a conflict that has seen human rights violations, and that needs to be considered.
Exactly. I think that needs to be considered. But technically speaking, unfortunately, as we speak now, NGOs and governments have agreed on explicit minimum requirements that if they were not met, we would say that Zimbabwe is not compliant. But if we would like to introduce anything such as, for instance, human rights or political instability, environmental issues, and so on, that would mean that that will have to apply across the board. We have set a precedent already, and if there has to be any change, it can only be effected at the next plenary session of the Kimberley Process.
Simply put, what then is a conflict diamond if the conditions in Zimbabwe don't quite constitute that?
Unfortunately, the other thing that complicates the situation in Zimbabwe is that, by the way, as far as the definition of the Kimberley Process is concerned, Zimbabwe is not necessarily classified as a country that is experiencing conflict diamonds. Our concern is more about them meeting minimum requirements of the Kimberley Process. Okay. And as I say that, we have set a precedent, so any change will have to be effected at some point in the near future.
Now, whilst all of this discussion takes place, the Minister of Mine has indicated publicly that they will sell their stockpiles of diamonds. They will sell them on the black market if they have to, and already there are rumors of buyers from reputable companies. What punitive measures can be instituted by the Kimberley Process if these actions are taken forward in a very controversial situation like this one?
It is unfortunate that Zimbabwe may want to resort to that, but I think if one were to advise the Zimbabwean government, I think it's important to operate within the Kimberley Process certification scheme. The reason being that if these diamonds are sold, they will contaminate legitimate trade in rough diamonds, and hence we have worked very hard with the Zimbabwean government to bring them as close as possible to complying with minimum requirements.
Frank, your input on this one. We know that globally, legitimately, on the legitimate market, diamond sales have dropped, a modest recovery recently, the Asians driving that demand, but diamond miners have had a torrid time.
Diamond miners have had a torrid time, exactly. I mean, diamonds are still seen as a luxury good for the public. Obviously, they're also used in manufacturing process. Both of those have taken a knock, either from income or wealth. I agree that what we're talking about here is a process, and a process that isn't resolved overnight, and it isn't black and white. And if you don't institute minimum requirements, where does one start? And I suppose that's the debate here.
Do you think that the Monitor has had to consider the general political environment in Zimbabwe, where in spite of how, or despite how, the Marange-Fields was seized by the Zimbabwean military, we're now in a situation of a government of national unity, not tamper with the goodwill that exists in that, and also the fact that there's a big need to re-inject investment in Zimbabwe? Do you think that may have been a variable?
I doubt it. I think it's a very objective set of rules applied to any country. The fact that they do have these other issues in the background, I doubt affected any of the behavior taken.
Abbey Chikane, were you under any political or corporate pressure to make sure that Zimbabwe comes out of this one unscathed, because they're in such desperate need of corporate investments in mining, and they're also in need of some kind of positive public relations, given the confusion around indigenization laws and just uncertainty about the investment climate?
I have not been under any political or any sort of pressure from any quarters around the world. The one thing that has motivated one's report is that minimum requirements of the Kimberley Process tend to encourage good corporate governance, transparency, accountability, responsibility, and all those principles that I think are important for Zimbabwe. And it was largely because of that one thought that we need to encourage Zimbabwe to comply fully with minimum requirements.
Thank you.